Presidents of the United States have always had a mix of serious business and personal life. People are often curious about the everyday things these powerful figures did, what their homes were like, and who they shared their lives with. That includes pets, of course. For a long time, presidential pets have been a big part of the White House story. They bring a touch of normal to what is a very unusual job, and sometimes these pets are not so normal. You see, for centuries, people in power have kept all kinds of animals. It was a sign of status or just a personal quirk. And kings and emperors had menageries. American presidents, though, usually stuck to more common animals like dogs and cats. But sometimes an unusual creature would show up. Andrew Jackson had a parrot. Theodore Roosevelt had a whole zoo almost, with everything from a badger named Josiah to a one-legged rooster. These stories make history more interesting. They make the people seem more real, more human. John Quincy Adams, the sixth president, is often remembered for his intelligence, his deep commitment to public service, and his serious nature. He wasn't known for being particularly lighthearted. He was a thinker, a diplomat, a man who kept detailed diaries. He was a son of a president, John Adams, and he carried a lot of weight on his shoulders. His time in the White House from 1825 to 1829 was a bit rough, full of political infighting and personal attacks. He wasn't a very popular president in the traditional sense, but he was undeniably a dedicated one. So when a story pops up about John Quincy Adams and a pet alligator, it really catches your attention. It's such an unexpected thing for him, given his reputation. The image it creates is vivid. A reserved intellectual president, possibly in his formal clothes, with a snapping reptile splashing around in a White House bathtub. It's the kind of detail that sticks with people. It feels like something out of like a quirky historical novel, not a dry textbook. And it makes you wonder if it's true. It certainly adds a splash of color to the otherwise somewhat gray portrait many people have of him. The White House itself was a very different place back then. It wasn't the bustling, highly secured compound we know today. It was still relatively new, having been rebuilt after the War of 1812. Life there was simpler in some ways, more personal. There weren't constant streams of media or public tours every day. The staff was smaller. The president and his family had a much more private existence within those walls, even though their lives were constantly under scrutiny from politicians and the press of the day. And the idea of a wild animal, an alligator, living in such a place, especially indoors, just feels out of time. Well, it makes you picture the challenges. How would you feed it? How would you keep it warm? Where would you get an alligator in the early 19th century in Washington, D.C.? These questions naturally come up when you hear such a wild story. It's a great tale, and that's why it has stuck around for so long. It's a legend that brings a serious man to life in a very unexpected way. It sets the stage for a deeper look into a really fun piece of presidential lore. The story goes like this. John Quincy Adams, President of the United States, received a gift. Not a book, not a fancy piece of furniture, but an alligator. And this alligator, the story claims, lived in a bathtub inside the White House. The most common version of this tale attributes the gift to the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette was a French hero of the American Revolution. He was a very important figure, a close friend of George Washington, and he made a grand return tour to the United States in 1824 and 1825. This was during Adams's presidency, and it was a huge event. Lafayette was celebrated everywhere he went. He was given countless honors and gifts, so the idea that Lafayette, during this epic tour, might have presented Adams with an exotic creature isn't entirely far-fetched on the surface. Lafayette traveled through many states, including some in the South where alligators were common. Maybe someone gave one to him as a curiosity, and he in turn passed it on to the president. It's easy to imagine how this idea could take root: an old general, a grand gesture, an unusual present for a high-minded president. It all fits into a certain kind of historical narrative. The detail about the bathtub is what really sells the story. It makes it concrete. An alligator isn't just kept in the White House, it has a specific, somewhat comical residence. A bathtub. This imagery is very powerful. It creates an instant picture in your mind. You can almost hear the splashing. Imagine the president or his staff going in to take a bath, only to find a reptile already occupying the tub. It's quirky, it's memorable, and it's slightly absurd, and because it's so specific, it feels more real, even if it might not be. This story, or versions of it, has been repeated for a very long time. It shows up in history books, tour guides, and casual conversations about presidential trivia. It's one of those bits of information that many people know about Adams, right alongside his very successful post-presidency career in the House of Representatives. It's almost become part of his public identity, a little splash of eccentricity for a man often seen as too formal or aloof. But where exactly did the story come from? That's a harder question to answer. Most popular anecdotes like this don't have a single clear origin point. They often evolve over time, perhaps starting as a rumor, a playful exaggeration, or a misremembered detail, and then growing into a full-blown legend. The fact that it involves Lafayette, a universally beloved figure, adds a layer of charm and credibility. Who would question a story involving the venerable Marquis? He was a living legend in his own right. And the story gains traction because it's unexpected. It clashes with Adams's known personality. Adams was not a man known for frivolous things. He was serious about his work, dedicated to learning, and quite rigid in his morals and routines. So the idea of him housing a wild animal in a bathtub feels delightfully out of character, which makes it even more appealing. It's like finding out a stern school principal secretly rides a unicycle. It humanizes the figure in a very specific, quirky way. So, the legend paints a picture of a White House with a very unusual resident. It suggests a president who, despite his serious demeanor, had a secret, perhaps even dangerous, hobby. It's a great story for tourists and kids alike, and it raises all sorts of questions about how plausible it really is. Could an alligator actually live in a bathtub in the White House in the 1820s? What would that even look like? And what does the historical record say about it? These are the questions we need to think about as we try to get to the bottom of this charming presidential myth. Now, let's look at the facts, or at least what we can find. When we dig into historical records, the story about John Quincy Adams and the alligator gets a bit murky. It's really hard to find solid, undeniable proof. Adams was a meticulous diarist. He wrote about almost everything. He documented his political struggles, his family life, his thoughts on science and literature, even the weather. His diaries are a treasure trove of information about his daily existence, but there's no mention of an alligator in a bathtub in them. You'd think something like that, something so unusual, would at least get a line or two. And it's not just his diaries. Letters from his family members, White House staff, or visitors also don't seem to mention such a creature. You'd expect someone, anyone, to remark on it. Imagine going to visit the president and seeing an alligator in his bathroom. That's not something you'd forget or fail to mention to someone else, yet there's a silence from the contemporary records that is quite striking. But let's think about the gift part. The Marquis de Lafayette did visit the United States in 1824 to 25. It was a huge celebratory tour. He was showered with gifts and honors everywhere he went. It's certainly possible that he received an alligator from someone, perhaps as a novelty from the southern states he visited. And it's also plausible that he might have given a gift to President Adams. That part of the story, the connection to Lafayette, adds a layer of believability, because Lafayette was indeed there and was indeed a major figure. The issue isn't so much whether an alligator was given to Adams, but what happened next. Did it live in a bathtub? This is where the practicalities really start to poke holes in the story. Think about the White House in the 1820s. Plumbing was not what it is today. Bathtubs were generally not fixed fixtures. They were often large, portable wooden or metal tubs that would be brought into a room, filled manually with heated water, used, and then emptied. They weren't like modern bathtubs with a constant water supply and drainage, so if an alligator was kept in such a tub, it would require constant care. The water would need to be changed regularly. It would need to be kept warm, especially in the DC winter. Alligators are cold-blooded and need warmth to survive. How would they heat the water? How would they dispose of the old water? Who would be doing this? It implies a level of dedicated and somewhat difficult care that seems unlikely for a presidential household, especially for a wild animal. And then there's the food. What would a White House staff feed an alligator in the 1820s? It's not like you could pop down to the pet store for a bag of alligator chow. They'd need to catch or acquire live prey. This, again, points to a very high level of specialized care that doesn't seem to fit the context of the time or the president's known interests. Adams was a serious man, engrossed in diplomacy, law, and politics. It seems unlikely he'd suddenly take on the role of an exotic animal keeper. Some historians have suggested that perhaps Lafayette received an alligator, and he kept it for a short time, maybe even at a guest house he stayed at. And then, perhaps the story got transferred to Adams, or maybe a small alligator was presented to Adams, and it was simply a temporary curiosity that was quickly given away or sent to a zoo if one even existed then. It might have been displayed briefly, but not kept as a long-term pet in a bathtub. There is another theory that sometimes pops up, suggesting Adams might have received a stuffed alligator. That would make a lot more sense as a curiosity or a gift. A preserved specimen would be a much easier thing to house and explain away. But The story always has it as a live, splashing creature. It's also worth noting that the story doesn't appear in very early, credible historical accounts, and it seems to gain popularity later on, which is often a sign of a developing legend rather than a direct eyewitness account. If it were true, it's such a striking detail that it should have been recorded by more than just vague whispers later on. So, while the idea of Lafayette giving a gift is plausible, the specific detail of a live alligator in a White House bathtub seems to struggle against the practicalities of the era and the silence of contemporary records. It's a fun story, and it certainly adds flavor to Adams's persona, but a careful look at the evidence makes you lean towards it being more folklore than fact, at least in its most dramatic form. It's important to remember that historical silence can be just as telling as what is recorded. And in this case, the silence is pretty loud about the alligator. So, if the evidence for a bathtub alligator is weak, how did this story become so famous? How does a tale like this take root and grow, even without strong historical backing? It's a fascinating look at how myths and legends develop around public figures, especially presidents. People love a good story, and a story about a serious president and an exotic, wild animal in his bathtub is just too good to pass up. One big reason these stories stick is that they add a human element to figures who might otherwise seem remote. John Quincy Adams was known for his intellect, his diplomatic skills, and his reserved nature. He wasn't exactly a charismatic, folksy kind of guy, so the alligator story gives him a touch of eccentricity, a hidden quirk that makes him more relatable, more interesting than just a stern statesman. It's like finding out your very proper professor secretly loves professional wrestling. It adds a layer of unexpected charm. The involvement of the Marquis de Lafayette is also key. He was a beloved hero, a symbol of Franco-American friendship and the revolutionary spirit. Any story connected to Lafayette carried a certain weight and appeal. If Lafayette gave it, it must be true, right? It lends an air of legitimacy to the anecdote, even if the details might have gotten muddled over time. People remember the big names and the unusual events associated with them. Then there's the exotic nature of the gift itself. An alligator isn't a common pet. It's from a different world, especially for people living in Washington, D.C. in the early 19th century. Exotic animals were often presented as diplomatic gifts or as curiosities by explorers and travelers. The idea of a wild, dangerous creature in the refined setting of the White House creates a wonderful contrast. It's a bit thrilling, it sparks the imagination, and let's not forget the bathtub detail. That's the real clincher. It takes the story from just, a president had an alligator too. A president had an alligator in his bathtub. That specific, slightly absurd image is what makes it so memorable. It's easy to picture. It's funny. It makes for great conversation. Details like this are often the hooks that allow a story to latch onto popular memory and refuse to let go. Over time, stories get embellished. A small kernel of truth, maybe Adams received a small, dead alligator as a curiosity, or perhaps someone else in Washington briefly housed an alligator can morph into a much grander, more dramatic narrative. Oral tradition plays a huge role in this. As stories are told and retold, details can change, get exaggerated, or be added to make the tale more engaging. Before the age of instant information and easy fact-checking, these anecdotes could spread and solidify very quickly. It also speaks to our desire for history to be exciting. Sometimes the truth can be a little dry. The day-to-day work of a president is often bureaucratic and complex, but a story about an alligator in a bathtub, yeah, that's entertaining. That's what people remember and share. It's a way to make history come alive, even if it's more legend than fact. Think about other historical myths. George Washington and the cherry tree. Abraham Lincoln freeing the pigs. Many of these stories have little direct evidence but persist, because they illustrate a desirable trait or a memorable moment about a famous person. They become part of the collective memory because they resonate with what we want to believe about our heroes. The alligator story does this for Adams. It gives a touch of unconventionality to a very conventional man. And the lack of an immediate, clear rebuttal in Adams's own time meant the story had room to breathe and grow. If he had directly addressed it in his diaries or letters as ridiculous nonsense, it might have died out faster. But in its absence, the story could flourish. It became a part of the historical landscape, passed down through generations, making its way into popular culture and becoming an accepted fact for many. It's a powerful example of how compelling narratives can sometimes override the quiet absence of evidence. So, the enduring popularity of the alligator story is a testament to how human beings interact with history. We seek out the unusual, the charming, the slightly scandalous. We want our historical figures to be more than just names in books. We want them to have stories, especially good ones, even if those stories are a little bit taller than the truth. So, after looking at all of it, did John Quincy Adams really have an alligator in a bathtub in the White House? The short answer is probably not in the way the popular story describes it. There's just no solid first-hand evidence from Adams himself, his family, or anyone else who was close to him at the time. His detailed diaries, which cover so much of his life, are completely silent on the matter. And the practicalities of keeping a live alligator in a White House bathtub in the 1820s just don't really add up. The plumbing wasn't set up for it, the care would have been extensive and difficult, and it seems wildly out of character for the reserved and serious Adams to take on such a peculiar pet. But the longer answer is that the story, whether fully true or not, has a power that goes beyond mere facts. It tells us something important about how we remember history, how we connect with figures from the past, and what kinds of stories resonate with us. The legend of the alligator has stuck around for nearly 2 centuries, and it continues to be one of the most talked about anecdotes about John Quincy Adams. Why does it stick? Well, it absolutely humanizes Adams. He was a brilliant man, a deeply dedicated public servant, and a very influential figure in American history, both as president and later as a congressman. But he was also seen as somewhat aloof, intellectual, and not particularly warm or outgoing. The image of him having an exotic pet, especially one as unusual as an alligator, adds a layer of unexpected charm and eccentricity to his persona. It makes him seem a bit more relatable, a bit more fun, a bit less like a marble statue. It also shows how much we love quirky details. History can sometimes feel very grand and distant. But these small personal stories, even if they're not fully accurate, bring it down to a human level. They make us smile, they make us think about the everyday lives of these historical giants. The idea of a president dealing with a reptile in his bathroom is just inherently amusing and memorable. It's the kind of thing that makes history stick in your mind, much more than a list of legislative accomplishments. And it speaks to the power of a good story. Even if there's only a tiny kernel of truth, maybe, Lafayette gave him something unusual, or perhaps a small, temporarily housed alligator was seen somewhere in Washington, and the story got twisted. The narrative takes on a life of its own. It grows, it gets embellished, and it becomes part of the shared cultural memory. It's a reminder that not all history is written in official documents. Some of it lives in the anecdotes and legends that get passed down. So, while we can't say with certainty that John Quincy Adams had an alligator splashing around in his bathtub, the story is certainly a testament to the enduring appeal of the unusual. It highlights our fascination with the private lives of public figures and our desire for history to be colorful and engaging. It's a story that makes us smile and makes us think about the many ways the past can surprise us. It also reminds us that presidential pets have always been a thing, and sometimes they've been quite odd. Adams might not have had a bathtub alligator, but other presidents certainly had their share of strange companions. Theodore Roosevelt had a menagerie that included a badger, a bear, a lion, a hyena, and a one-legged rooster. Thomas Jefferson had a pair of grizzly bear cubs on the White House lawn for a while. Andrew Jackson had a parrot that reportedly swore so much it had to be removed from his funeral. So, the spirit of unusual presidential pets is definitely real. The Adams alligator story, whether fact or fiction, serves as a delightful entry point into the world of early American presidential life. It's a story that brightens up the historical record and ensures that even the most serious of presidents can have a touch of playful legend attached to their name. And in the end, that's not such a bad thing. It makes history a little less intimidating and a lot more fun. And it shows that even presidents, despite all their burdens, can inspire stories that are wonderfully, sometimes ridiculously human.